He says, why assume that in the 21st century there will be a successor to America's 20th century power? If you want to understand what is really happening with the US dollar, with US power in the world, with US leadership of the world and the international financial system, read one serious historian. I'm Jeff Rich, this is the Burning Archive, and I'm going to give you my history book recommendation about history, the US dollar, and US global power. Let's go forward to the second book of the trilogy from Adam Tooze, which is Crashed: How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World. This book here. Now, towards the end of this book, he actually reflects on World War I and how this extraordinary crisis, sleepwalking towards a crisis, has become emblematic in many ways of how one thinks about working through a global crisis. And Crashed is the story of what Tooze describes in this book as the first crisis of the global age. Globalization is often seen as starting in the 1990s. The 2008 crisis and subsequent crises is referred to by Adam Tooze as the first big crisis of that age of what a lot of people understand as the unique age of globalization, and one in which some people feared, forces of deglobalization, whether populism or the splitting apart of the global economy into different economic blocks began. And he, in talking about the book, he actually talks about Adam Tooze, interviewing Timothy Geithner, who was a leading, I think, the Treasury Secretary or a leading economic official in the US government at the time, and describing how, in Timothy Geithner's view, although the subsequent stories is that, the masters of the universe got the whole thing under control and managed affairs wisely, he had a real sense of not being at all in control of events. And my recollection of working in government during that economic crisis was that was pretty much the ubiquitous sense. People really did have a sense of the world unwinding, unraveling, and desperately trying to get back in charge of events, but not actually really being terribly sure that they were. And this feeds into his theme of American power being an improvised response in response to all sorts of terribly complex economic and financial systems and processes and actors and conflicting interests. He creates that wonderful sense of history being lived at the time as a one-way ticket into the unknown. And his history also takes us back to the Second World War in 1944, when the Bretton Woods Agreement was formed. Still during World War II, it's not quite a post-war agreement, but it led to the creation of the post-1945 financial institutional structure of the World Bank, the IMF, and the US dollar as reserve currency of the world. And his argument is subtle and sophisticated, and I'm not really going to try to fully summarize it here, but he really does emphasize the way in which America did improvise a crucial response during the 2008 crisis. While people were seeing a multipolar world break out beforehand, it improvised a dramatic resurgence, in a way, of American economic power, but perhaps a somewhat brutal one. So he has chapters that look at the gathering storm, the global crisis, the Eurozone, and aftershocks. He takes the story all the way up to kind of 2013, 2014 and the Ukraine crisis, which had a very significant economic and financial dimension. It covers, the Greek and, Southern Europe sort of financial crises, the Eurozone, and of course he covers events in 2008 2008, but he also provides a really coherent account of how the current sort of world financial system came into being. It's one of the great benefits of reading this book. Much, much better than 1,000 YouTube videos on the topic. And he really presents the story as an uncontrolled, rolling crisis, which, despite complacent stories today, never really was fully contained and dramatically shifted the power between Europe and the United States. If I just quote a brief section from the book, what we have to reckon with now is that, contrary to the basic assumption of 2013, the crisis was not, in fact, over. What we face is not repetition, but mutation and metastasis. As part 4 of this book will chart the financial and economic crisis of 2007 to 2012, morphed between 2013 and 2017 into a comprehensive political and geopolitical crisis of the post-Cold War order. And the obvious political implications should not be dodged. Conservatism might have been disastrous as a crisis-fighting doctrine, but events since 2012 suggest that the triumph of centrist liberalism was false too, as the remarkable escalation of the debate about inequality in the United States has starkly exposed centrist liberals' struggle to give convincing answers for the long-term problems of modern capitalist democracy. It's an absolutely brilliant book, and especially for someone like me who's a I don't understand how all those weird financial instruments work. It's a brilliantly clear account of the dynamics of the new world, and that is one of the strengths of this book. He actually looks in detail at the actual phenomenon of the new technical complexity of finance and how it interacts with war and politics and power. There is a new reality to this game. You actually have to dig into the workings of the financial machine while being aware of the limits of economic and technical financial analyses of these kinds of issues. There's a wonderful quote in the book by I think he's an economist, Abel Lerner, that economics has gained the title Queen of the Social Sciences by choosing solved political problems as its domain. Now, of course, it's a challenging book because of all that technical complexity. It is even longer than The Deluge. It's about 600 pages with, maybe 80 pages of notes as well. So, but an extraordinary resource, and I really if you are interested in these issues, US dollar, US power, I really recommend you read it. And towards the end of the book, he also emphasizes the fact that the emergence of China as a global economic and financial power has really changed this equation quite a bit also. The third book I'll be a little bit briefer on, and that is Shutdown, How COVID Shook the World's Economy. And this was an unplanned book in the series there. You can see it there. But he notes that 2020 exposed how dependent the economy was on the stability of its environment, seeing 2020 as a comprehensive crisis of the neoliberal era with regard to its environmental envelope. It was a virus, a physical thing after all. Its domestic, social, economic and political underpinnings and the international order help us find our historical bearings. And it's a crisis in which Tooze found American policymakers and American politics were found wanting. He looks at the whole issues of the emergence of the virus, the global crisis it provoked, the unprecedented economic actions that governments really took in response to it, the extraordinary northern summer of 2020, which had all sorts of political dimensions, and the interregnum since. And it also marks a more explicit move in Adam Tooze's thinking to focus more on environment and polycrisis, not just on economics and finance. And the sense in which he does find the American, I guess, political leadership group wanting in response to this crisis is, if you like, a bipartisan slap on both parties' wrists. He's very critical of Trump, but he also, written in the early days of the Biden presidency, quite critical of Biden, because he looks not at those individuals, but at the system and the political institutions underpinning them or enabling them or disabling them. With Trump as president, pluralism and incoherence were a saving grace. In light of the experience of 2020, it is not obvious whether America and the world have more to fear from a unified American government, subject to risk of capture by the nationalist right, or a more incoherent American regime in which key levers of power remain the purview of functional elites, globalised interests, and modernising coalitions in key centres like New York and Silicon Valley. The polite way of framing this, for instance, when conversation turns to the latest impasse in American climate policy, is to argue that a progressive future for the United States depends on the dynamism of subnational actors. For all the enthusiasm surrounding the early months of the Biden administration, the haunting question remains: is the United States as a nation-state capable of responding in a coherent and long-term fashion to the challenges of the Great Acceleration? He also here talks about the rise of China. Adam Tooze elaborates on those thoughts in his other appearances on podcasts and videos, so you can check out his Ones and Twos podcasts. You can check out his lecture to the London Review of Books on American hegemony. You can check out his debate with Robert Kagan, the archpriest of neoconservatism, a neoconservative foreign policy in America, Robert Kagan, about his book, The Deluge. You can watch a discussion of him in German. He is a fluent German speaker talking about US hegemony, where he is a little bit more direct than perhaps he is for his English-speaking audiences. And you can even watch a fascinating discussion with him, with Zoltán Pozsár, the Hungarian economist, on the US dollar. Zoltán Pozsár, I think, had proposed the idea of a Bretton Woods 3 emerging, where there's a new balance, I guess, between money and real things, real commodities. What are his views on the US dollar? He's written a series of articles on this in Foreign Policy, in the Financial Times, and importantly on his Substack. And he frequently comments on the US dollar, noting its greater resilience than many people who constantly predict US dollars about to collapse do so. He is much more nuanced and informed than many of the commentators on de-dollarization. It's not that he's not critical of the financial situation in the US. He sees it as a fiscal mess that's unsustainable, and that the United States is grasping onto this sort of unipolar moment, even as the world is increasingly clearly a multipolar world. It's an unbalanced fiscal situation where there's a reliance on external payers and their exorbitant privilege of the US dollar, with rising inequality and growing incoherence of its politics. But he does not see US money and US global power as a unitary thing. He sees it as a very complicated network. And he describes a lot of the talk on YouTube and other places of de-dollarization as fin-fi, as in, sci-fi or fan fiction sort of thing. It would seem to be a natural counterpart of a multipolar world that the dominance of America's national currency should diminish. But he really argues that currency systems are woven into the fabric of the economy. They do condition patterns of investment and trade. So if the world economy changes, so surely should the currency system. But what is actually happening? How is it actually changing? And he's pointing out here that history is not necessarily a good guide, that we have two cases that people have generalized into a standard model of the sterling system that's really operated for a relatively brief period, and the US dollar system that has operated since the war, with quite a few challenges and many transformations. The original Bretton Woods system, the free float, and the more recent regime of very complex financial transactions known as global swap lines. He says it is not a well-balanced, rules-based system with a clear structure, clear limits, rules and boundaries determined in Wall Street or Washington. It is, he says, a hierarchical and unequal, but also open-ended network or assemblage which develops under the impulse of profit, capital accumulation, and institutional initiatives from many different sources. It is highly unequal, crisis-prone, and constantly changing. It is by the interaction between macroeconomics, macrofinance, and geoeconomics that the dollar's system will be decided. He's written some really fantastic Substack pieces on the dollar, and I highly recommend you check them out. And through his Substack chart book, you also get a sense of his eclectic mind and his more freewheeling writing, less formal than in the books, less conventional, let's say, than perhaps his Financial Times and foreign policy appearances are. And in particular, he challenges, along with people like John Darwin, the whole idea of US hegemony. He really sees US hegemony as an idea born in that time of 1916 and carried like a torch ever since, but one which does not necessarily need to continue. He says, why assume that in the 21st century there will be a successor to America's 20th century power? To do so is just to trap yourself into a certain kind of history repeating itself, cyclical thinking that is not really true. I hope you do take the opportunity to hook into Adam Tooze's exceptional, fertile and creative mind, and do check out his Substack on US hegemony, dollar empire, the financial system, and go over to my Substack, the Burning Archive Substack, at jeffrich.substack.com, and subscribe to my Substack too.